Good evening, everyone. Welcome to what I think is the 14th installment of our Bob and Elizabeth Dole series on leadership. As some of you know, the purpose of this series is to call on leaders from national and local politics, from business, education, advocacy, the arts, to help us understand what are the circumstances and the characteristics that generate true leadership. What is it that enables some people to overcome the obstacles that are inherent in a diverse country and bring people together? So to reflect on that modest and important question, we are joined today by one of our nation's most dynamic leaders, Derek Johnson. Derek was appointed president of the NAACP in October of 2017. Prior to having a number of roles at NAACP, he founded and directed One Voice, which is a Mississippi-based organization focused on enhancing the quality of life for African Americans through civic engagement and training. Among the many other experiences and accomplishments, which I will elaborate together, I just want to mention that Derek was appointed by the Chief Justice of the Mississippi Supreme Court to the Access to Justice Committee. He was appointed by one of our friends, Governor Haley Barbour, to serve on the Recovery and Rebuilding and Renewal Commission following Katrina, graduate of South Texas College of Law and Tougaloo College. And so lastly, before we dive in, I just want to mention how proud we are to name this series in the honor of extraordinary service of Elizabeth and Bob Dole. Both the Doles are proud partisans who, over long careers, were able to overcome real diversity and show the confidence and also the creativity that dignifies differences and builds coalitions to make the country work a little bit better. And so we're delighted, Derek, to have you here in that discussion. What I want to try to do is 3 or 4 things, and then we'll give the crowd some opportunity to ask some questions. I want to talk a little bit about you. I want to talk a little about the NAACP agenda. You've talked a bunch about leadership directly, which is part of our focus, and then if we have time, we're spending a lot of time thinking about social mobility and opportunity in the country, and maybe have a chance to talk with you a little bit about that broadly, but also as it relates to racial questions. So to start with you, upon your selection, you said, "We are facing unprecedented threats to our democracy, and we will not be sidelined while our rights are being eroded every day. We remain steadfast and immovable and stand ready on the front lines of the fight for justice." So leadership is about knowing when to fight. We believe at the BPC that democracy is a good fight. It's not a gentle sport. Let me just open up with the easiest question. What has it been like leading the NAACP for the last 2 years?
Reinvigorating. It is the nation's oldest civil rights organization, 110 years old. For African Americans, it is our way to add voice to this democracy. We, as an organization, we are a bottom-up operation. That we believe in small d democracy, so every member who attend the meeting have equal voice than any other member. Those members across the country in 47 states, over 2,200 units, they inform our policy priorities as a national. And so for me to hear voices from Alabama or Alaska or Hawaii or Connecticut, that's reinvigorating. There's also it confirms what I seen living in Mississippi or growing up in Detroit. The African Americans were not a monolith, while at the same time there is a level of collective consciousness, particularly when we are at threat from a system that has not always valued us as human beings, or a system that sought to exploit us as cheap labor.
So one of the kind of cliches when people talk about leadership is this nature-nurture. Are leaders made or born? And of course the answer is always yes in some combination. But you like to talk about the fact that you were not the most focused student in high school. When did you see the public arena as a place where you felt comfortable? Were you a leader of your friends in the neighborhood? Were you?
I was smaller. I couldn't fight. I had no brothers or sisters. I was a rough neighborhood, so I figured out how to negotiate my way through it, the process. So I don't know if you call it leadership or survival, but I was able to negotiate safety.
Um, One of the other stories you mentioned, which I have to get you to repeat, is your ability to see opportunity.
Mhm.
And talk a little about how you first became engaged with the NAACP.
So, I was at a small school in Mississippi that has since closed, Mary Holmes College. It was one of the few two-year HBCUs. And the state president of NAACP's daughter worked at the school, and so she encouraged me to get involved, start an ACP chapter there, and I did. I didn't know who her father was. While at the exact same time I was working in a library, and I began to read more about civil rights, and particularly Mississippi's civil rights history. I don't recall going to that first meeting, and it dawned on me that her father was somebody I was reading about in the book, Aaron Henry, who was also a part of the group that individuals tried to kill when they killed Medgar Evers. Get to the meeting, and I'm watching a person sit there. His name was C.C. Bryant. He was the person that that brought SNCC in, that helped organize Watch on the Ground, and Gilbert Mason, who had integrated the Biloxi Beach, and Winston Hudson, who was known civil rights leader, her and her twin sister, Winston Hudson. And this is in 1990, and I'm thinking, like, these people are still alive and they're still fighting. And they're doing it through this vehicle called the NAACP in a town called Louisville, Mississippi, and they were meeting there because the state education chair had called for a boycott of a city because it was not complying with a consent order. And I realized the consent order was based on Brown versus Board of Education from 1955. I was like, and we're still fighting that same fight in 1990. All of that was intriguing. The fact that these individuals were still engaged at the level in which they were engaged. And it was a full room of energized people with strong opinions about whatever they thought they should offer up on the table. It was fascinating.
Now, you also tell a story, though, about getting stuck in a dorm room.
I didn't want to go to that part, but that's... Well, Dr. Henry's daughter was also the dorm director, and I had to go study in the girls' dorm, and it was...
Because the lighting was better.
The lighting was better in the girls' dorm, but there was no co-ed visitation.
Sure it was.
I was skipping over that part.
One of the other things that a lot of people who have prominent roles talk about is just the challenge of staying grounded.
Mm-hmm.
You have 5 kids.
Yes.
You are in constant motion.
Yes.
How do you stay in constant motion and stay grounded in the things that are important to you?
Having a good spouse. Having someone who, no matter where I am, what title, is that reminder, but is also being humble enough to understand that none of this is about me. It is about all the people I represent. And going home and washing clothes from time to time, and or making sure I fill up the gas tank. It is working with the NAACP as a volunteer for so many years. Give me a sense of appreciation for the organization, not a sense of entitlement for the title.
We also talk a lot about the ability of leaders to set agendas that are both stir the soul but have some direction. You talked about 3 measures of a healthy democracy.
Yes.
Caring for the elderly, preparing kids for a brighter future, protecting the rights of the disadvantaged. Say more about how you came up with that as the kind of framework for the organization.
I don't know when I started saying or came up with it, but I recall in the political space, particularly in the South and specifically Mississippi, you can move policy based on 3 big buckets. One, the use of fear on race, the use of fear dealing with morality, or regional fights. You can control tax policy and policy in general. If you put a fear argument on race, you can get people to vote against their interests. If you can put a morality lens on a piece of policy, you can get people to vote to privatize their Social Security, for example. And same-sex marriage has nothing to do with Social Security system. Blacks are not taking anybody's job, but if you rattle that cage loud enough, you get people to run in the wrong directions. But those same people say they're compassionate Christians.
So this is an affirmative agenda.
Right? And so I said, okay, if in this place I call Mississippi, in this space of the Bible Belt, the South, if you're true Christians, the church that I belong to, the church that I learned, was there are only two great commandments. Love thy God with all thy mind and thy heart, and love thy neighbor. And if you love thy neighbor, then you have to go to that place where, are we doing what's necessary for our elderly? Are we doing what's necessary for our youth? And are we doing what's necessary for the disadvantaged, the vulnerable? Because it's not about loving thy neighbor because they're rich and they're doing better than you and don't want to look up to them. It's loving thy neighbor by doing for those who are most in need, doing for those who are vulnerable. And those are the categories that we should care about. And that care is not something that we pray about in church. That care is something that you implement in policy.
So talk about leadership a little bit. You alluded to this earlier, and I've heard you talk about it. The importance of not having kind of egocentric leadership. And just to push that a little farther, when I've heard you talk about it, it certainly rings us some critique over, if not the Obama administration, just the kind of cult around the ability of President Obama to lead this country in a powerful way.
For me, it goes even beyond. Well, it goes to the whole Martin Luther King culture, right? The richness of my experience in Mississippi was one in which I was able to, and still in many ways, interact with civil rights activists and leaders who are nationally known but always locally grounded. Whether it was individuals who was involved in ACP or Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And the thing I learned through that process was that in Mississippi, it was never an egocentric movement, and we gained more out of it. In other places, they were waiting on someone to come to give the big speech, the big charismatic personality, and that's disempowering. So working with Hollis Watkins, one of the SNCC veterans, and when I was with a group called Southern Echo, we would go to community, and he would say the role of an organizer is to help identify local leadership, plural, and push that local leadership forward. The goal of the organizers is to help the community identify their expertise and be empowered with their expertise so they can gain voice. And out of that, help facilitate a process so they can overcome the fear of really adding their voice to the change they would like to see. That's community-centric. That's not about me getting in front of the room speaking. That's about empowering the room because I'm going to leave that community. And people still need to survive and navigate a system that has not always been kind to them.
And am I reading into what you were saying? But I mean, it felt a little bit like you were suggesting that there was some complacency out of the kind of profundity of electing an African-American president. That people were saying, look, use this as an example, racism has been fundamentally addressed.
I think the election of 2008 was a huge milestone. In the speech that I gave, it was at that moment that many of us know exactly where we were when it was announced. Where we seen old men cry. You've seen women shout, kids just run around with excitement because what people thought was never possible is now possible. In our community, they say, before a black man get elected, hell will freeze over. The devil was cold as hell that night. I mean, it was special, right? But it wasn't just about the person. And we didn't live in a post-racial society as a result of it. And it required more of us, not less of us. That was not the finish line. That was the start of something even greater for this democracy. And in many ways, people were waiting for that next moment. In 2016, we were waiting for that next moment. No, we have to build on that moment, not wait for another moment like it.
So, we spent a lot of time at the Bipartisan Policy Center grappling with the tribal realities of this town. When you've been working at NAACP, you've talked a lot about the importance of civility as opposed to tribalism. And at the same time, you're involved in some incredibly contentious and challenging, emotionally kind of riven arguments. How do you think about those two challenges, about the passion of the moment and at the same time the obligation in a democracy to kind of engage people whose views you really find very difficult to?
You can have a civil discord And it's okay. We can disagree. We can talk. We can see things from different perspectives. If two men sit at the bar who absolutely hate each other's perspectives but respect each other, you can figure out solutions. But if you refuse to even sit down and have a conversation, if you refuse to figure out that the 15% of the things that you agree on and do away with the 85% that you disagree on, you would never figure out how to live 100% of the time together. And so the loss of civility has created such a tribal reality in our political space that people can watch the 6 o'clock news on 2 different channels and get 2 completely sense of reality. Fox, CNN, or Fox, MSNBC, completely different senses of reality. And it's mind-boggling because in one of those realities, facts don't matter. And so when we lose civility, the ability just to hear each other, when we disrespect each other to the point where we will believe something that's factually not true, then we have a problem in this democracy.
So in your role as leader of NAACP, you get invited up all kinds of places.
Mm-hmm.
I know you've forged a relationship with Senator Hatch. Be interested in hearing about that a little bit, but also interested in like other people you've encountered who, you were surprised at your ability to engage constructively.
So funny story with Senator Hatch. I was on a safari with a friend of mine, Will Cologne, and his individuals there who were really close to Senator Hatch. And Will had gone and spoke at Brigham Young Orrin Hatch lecture series, first African American to do so. And so
he's sitting right there, just so you all know.
Right? Yeah, that's
you can't really say
right
much about him while he's sitting right there.
And so then one of the guys say, "You're going to be our next speaker." Will was the first one. He did an outstanding job. We want you to come do it. Sure. I'm not a Mormon. Never been to Brigham Young. Never considered Utah at all. So I go out here. I'm preparing this speech, and I'm in the midst of preparing the speech. I'm just watching what was taking place, 2010, 2011, and Glenn Beck was the big thing on Fox News at the time. And I'm watching this buffoonery of a show that he had, recounting this revisionist history. And it's the complete loss of civility, complete denial of facts, historical facts. And so I'm preparing this speech because what else can I say to an Orrin Hatch lecture series, and Orrin Hatch is sitting on the front bench, other than the need for us to continue the dialogue. Well, what I didn't know, Glenn Beck is also a Mormon. And so my wife said, "What you gonna do?" I said, "Well, can't no speech, I just want to name him." So afterwards, Senator Hatch leaned up to my wife, he says, "I don't think your husband like Glenn Beck much, do you?" She started laughing, she said, "No," she said, "I don't either." Okay? But that opened up a dialogue. Because the loss of civility meant that I wouldn't want to, and perhaps Glenn Beck would want to sit in the same room and have a conversation with each other. Because to intentionally mislead people against their own interests, against the interests of this country, is something that we shouldn't tolerate. While at the exact same time, if there are policy differences, we should tolerate the opportunity to communicate with each other. It's one thing to have a difference in policy perspective. And all this is about taxes. Who gets taxed? Who's not taxed? And how do we spend our tax dollars? You can sum up all of government right there.
Follow the money.
Follow the money. And we can disagree with that. For some of us who've been married over 20 years, we disagree with that with our wives. How we,
No experience with that.
no, not at all, right? But with that, you can never lose the ability just to sit in a room and disagree agreeably and move on to the next thing until you can come back to figure it out together. Because in many cases, neither side have the true solution. It's a mixture of everything there, and how do you get to that place if you're not talking?
I've always said I've never met anybody who's 100% wrong.
Yes.
I met people who are like 90% wrong, which is really wrong,
Yes.
right? But not 100%
But that
wrong.
10% could be the magic bullet to something.
So let's talk a little bit about your policy agenda, which is very broad. What are a couple of the issues that NAACP is really focused on now that you have some optimism about, that you see moving forward even in these kind of unruly political times?
Everything else is around the civic engagement calendar. When I walked in the door, I say this next 5 years is the most important in the life of this nation's democracy in terms of what direction we're going to go in. And African Americans, we're going to play a critical role in that. Midterms election, how aggressively we turn out, how focused we are in terms of our candidate selections, and whether or not we hold those candidates accountable if they're in office. This year, preparation for the 5 state elections that's taking place: Mississippi, Louisiana, Kentucky, New Jersey, Virginia, because those legislative bodies, that outcome is going to determine the drawing of the political boundaries we call redistricting for those states. As we prepare for the census process next year, as we prepare for the 2020 election, as we prepare for the redistricting, drafting alliance once the census is drawn, as we prepare for the 22 midterm elections. In that time span, that's going to determine the direction for the next 12 years. Because the census we determine federal allocations, the drawing of the district alliance will freeze in time legislative district for 10 years into the next cycle, and those policy makers will give us an opportunity to reverse the damage that has been done over the last 2 years by this president.
We spend a lot of time thinking about economic opportunity, right? The basic premise of the country. Mm-hmm. Work hard, and then the question is the premise for everybody, but at least for some people, right? Work hard, play by the rules, do better than your parents. It's not really true now for most people. You just look at a couple of statistics, right? The wages have been flat since 1980, while productivity's doubled. Top 5% of the population has 2/3 of the wealth. Bottom 90% has about 20% of the wealth. You've talked about affordable housing, educational attainment, job issues. Where are the places where you feel like you could have the most traction in addressing that basic challenge?
The answer is yes to all those things, right? We are in the second gilded period. And in this gilded period, we're denying the fact that we're here. Laissez-faire government didn't work in the 20s, leading to the stock market crash. The second gilded period also didn't work. We've seen the housing market crash. We didn't learn enough from it. And so we're going back in time all over again. The most sustained period in this nation's economic history was that period between 1933 and 1980. And it was during that period of time where we had an aggressive federal government ensuring equity and opportunity through New Deal policies, the Great Society policies, and later a civil rights agenda. The African Americans, we didn't benefit like we should have with the New Deal policies, a little bit more with the Great Society policies, and right when we was about to turn the corner with the civil rights agenda, Reagan walks in the door. And so if we're true about economic mobility, there's no one silver bullet, it's quality education for all children. And we need to determine as a nation, are we going to drive that conversation nationally, or are we going to continue to allow local industries to drive it to cheapen their workforces in some area and really provide quality education to children in other areas? That type of inequity is not sustainable in a global economy. It may have been sustainable in a national economy, but in a global economy, there are too many countries who take it serious enough to say, you know what, we're going to revamp our whole education system. We're going to make sure that we have the right type of apprenticeships in place, and we're going to make sure there's real social mobility. That's a national policy priority that we must take on, and because of the tribalism that we see in the fights over tax policies, it's not taking place.
You mentioned opportunities for civility. I think the president spoke yesterday at the HBCU forum and said he was going to increase or had increased federal funding by, it was 14%. Well, my staff said that he signed legislation that increased funding by 14%, that the actual budget was flatlined or a little lower. But nevertheless, it was a gesture of some engagement. I mean, how did you have any sense that that was a productive step that you could take advantage of?
I don't even know the quality of the statement he made. Until him saying it says nothing to me. It has to be in black and white, and then the check still have to clear the bank. That's the level of integrity he has demonstrated out from that office.
So as you think about the next few years, what are the things that, in addition to obviously trying to focus on the electoral map and leadership, I mean, where are the other issues that you think an organization like ours could be thinking about as we look to make sure that there is actually inclusive opportunity for all folks?
A bipartisan effort is about how do you bring people with different perspectives to the table to begin to talk, or not even talk, get to know each other. Because it is in that moment that you can come up with some of the most creative opportunities. I'm very clear. Lyndon Johnson was not a friend of African Americans. He happened to be the president who realized the legacy and the importance of doing some significant things that was perhaps the greatest policy advancements for African Americans of any president. But before he became president, he was not a nice guy. But once he got there, he opened up opportunity for African Americans. A bipartisan policy center allowed people to see a perspective differently than their environment. And with that, be able to figure out where true solutions lie. My experiences growing up in Detroit, living in Mississippi, is very unique to me. Your experience is very unique to you. And how we see the world is only shaped by those experiences. How we share our worldview can only make me stronger and you more enlightened.
That is a nice moment to pause for a minute. I have about 16 more questions, but this is a democracy. So love to open it up for some questions. We have some folks with microphones. Who would like to pose a thought? Right over here. Just let us know who you are. And then...
Brian Senna with SW4 Insights. So I'm curious, in this current administration, and you talk about engaging with the Hill and with the administration. As someone who also helps clients engage with the relevant stakeholders in DC, what tips can you share about how you've gone about not so much dealing with folks you're already friendly with, but those who might not necessarily be receptive to your ideas? How do you first engage and get them to see, not only see your point of view, but at least appreciate your point of view?
What has worked for me has always been a person to help on around. I'm not the best person to say, oh, that's a good Republican, now let me go talk to him, or that's a good white guy, let me go talk to him. Okay? It's always good to have as many people that you can trust make connections for you. And trust is something you build, just saying they have a respect of these set of principles that we can agree on. And with that, open doors and be open to hear and be a part of experiences that's different than your norm. And that has always worked for me. Some people do it differently. Some people go join groups they really don't agree with, but they just want to meet the people. I can't do that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
More questions? In the back.
My name is Daniel Martins. I work here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. The NAACP is a storied institution. I was just wondering how you balance maintaining the legacy of the organization with ideas that you think are the best for how to move the agenda of the organization moving forward.
I don't think those things are in conflict. The beautiful thing about NAACP, we're a small D democracy. And so before I took the position, it would be nothing for me and colleagues from different cities or states to launch an effort to define the policy priorities for the association for that year, because we do it through a legislative process. And so if you respect people, if you respect the diversity of our community, you respect the structure of the organization, you may not agree with all of the final outcomes, but it gave voice to people to have input. How I see a policy issue from my vantage point and how it's impacted the community that I live around could be completely different than someone living in New York. And so they're gonna bring a different perspective and conversation to the table. But out of respect, that give and take, we may land somewhere, I may disagree, but I can live with that because it allowed for a process for voices to be heard. Next year I may come back and try to change it again. But in that, that's the legacy of the organization. That's why we have survived 110 years. And this question of being storied, if we wasn't storied, we wouldn't be here for 110 years. Because democracy is messy, but it's necessary so you can have inclusive voices to really drive the priorities of an organization like the NAACP. And messy is good.
Question over here, right in the middle.
Hello, my name is Andrew Russ. I'm a local pastor here in Washington, D.C. As a leader, you talk about communication. You mentioned Glenn Beck. So obviously he's an effective communicator because he's persuading people, right? But as a leader, you're in a different position. You're able to see things that those who you're leading don't see. So as a leader, how do you define, when you take wisdom, what is effective communication? How do you speak the truth in love? What is communication, in terms of leading people to truth looks like?
But first of all, how do you define your truth?
Okay.
Right, that's one. Two, I come from that place. My job is to push leadership forward. Egocentric personalities will fail us every time. You build demagogues. You create traps for people to be misled. And so I will always fight against that because I believe in the institution of the whole. And so my job is to push people forward, allow people to see information and evaluate information. And so when you have demagogue type personalities, or when you have egocentric personalities, I'm always weary because sometimes that could be the Pied Piper leading us to places that we should not go. Pastors included. No, not talking about you. Not talking about you, but I'm saying.
No, you're right.
Question over here.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. My name is Tricia Ferrone. I work here. And you have 5 children. What is your greatest fear for your children, and what is your greatest hope for them? If there's a short answer.
Well, I'll start with I feed them once a day. That's the goal. That's the bar. Greatest hope is that they're able to realize their full potential and exercise the options they would like to see in life. The fear is that it's encumbered by external forces or by them not believing in themselves. I think that's most important. From there, fear and hope like everyone else will have, but their ability to live their full, true potential and not be encumbered.
Well, the question was not posed to me. I will note that my daughter got her driver's license today, so you should all fear
There you go.
if you are in the roads of Montgomery County. Time for a couple more questions.
Teresa Brown, I also work here. You talked about the institution of the NAACP as a democracy, and one of the things we talk a lot about here at the BPC is the health of our national institutions in this age of incivility. And you also spoke about the level of trust in your institution and the people in your institution. One of the issues we face a lot is the lack of trust in our federal institutions by the people and among the people in the institutions and each other. What do you think is necessary to try to build back that trust, and both within the institutions and for the public witness?
But if you talk about our public institution, federal institution, there has to be a time where policymakers and political leaders move away from partisanship and reestablish the guardrails. The guardrails have been taken off. And for some people, they are in fear of addressing it because of their own internal party dynamics. For others, they don't know how to address it, so they go to the same narrative they always go to based on their own party dynamics. But at some point, we have to, as Americans, talk about, is it okay for a National Weather Service to say X, and someone with a Sharpie draw something on a map and say Y, which is completely erroneous? The National Weather Service is nonpartisan, say, no, this is X, and then they are threatened and their jobs are threatened? When do leaders say, no, this is not acceptable? There are some things that should just be off limits because it's for all of our safety. And how do we get back there? First step is we got to get this guy out of the White House. That's not a partisan statement. That's a statement about the health of our democracy. This guy is a threat, and that needs to be addressed. The unfortunate part, we have too many people in the Republican Party who won't acknowledge that because they are looking at whatever political advantages they can maintain, or they are afraid of the loss of a political advantage for the future. But this guy is a threat. Can you imagine if Barack Obama did 1/10 of the things that was being done now? He had a tan suit on one day and they thought it was heresy.
Maybe we have another question here, sir.
Cornelius Baker, Emory University. I'm wondering, this is obviously the bipartisan policy center. We think of that mostly in terms of, the parties that we have in the political environment. But your job is to lead the black people, colored people in the country. And there are political issues that also tear us apart, when social issues. Thinking about, for example, the lives of black transgender women who are tremendously disadvantaged in employment, result of sex work, have high rates of HIV, death, violence. Even in this city, we've had 5 or 6 murders in the last 9 months. And we don't have black people advocating for their lives. And we have a White House that is actively condemning the lives of transgender people. How do you balance that role of bringing all black people together in a divisive political culture where all black people don't share the same politics on some of those issues?
Right, so I started saying, afterwards, we're not a monolith, so that's be clear. But for NAACP, our position on LGBT has always been, is very clear. We partner with David Johns and National Black Coalition for Justice on that very issue. They're our experts to help inform our policy direction dealing with transgender and the violence that they've been faced with. So we're not conflicted on that issue. At this last convention, we had a LGBT town hall meeting. So there's no conflicts there. When we adopted, I was on the board at the time, our position on same-sex marriage, it was the most wonderful discussion anyone could have heard. I'm just upset it was an executive session and it wasn't taped.
It should have been.
Right? But it was such a beautiful conversation. Here's why. It was the pastors in the room who led the charge. I can remember Bishop Graves, presiding bishop of the CME Church. Deep voice, he says, I am the presiding bishop of the CME Church. I am very clear of my role sitting at the table of bishops. We struggle with doctrine on several things, but this is not the table of bishops. This is the NAACP. It is our job to advocate for equal protection under the law. So I am here not as Bishop Graves looking at doctrine. I'm here as Bishop Graves as a board member of the NAACP, and equal protection of the law demand us to advocate for all of our community. Went from Amos Brown, missionary Baptist preacher, 3rd Missionary Baptist Church in San Francisco. He said, I'm in San Francisco. This is a reality that I don't have to grapple with because I love all my congregation. Went from there to William Barber, Church Christ, Disciples of Christ, Poor People Movement. Barber went on his thing. It was led by the preachers. And so we have this misnomer somehow that the black church or the NAACP is anti-something. In many ways, no. Now, can we disagree? Absolutely. Should we disagree on some stuff? Yes. But at the same time, we love all our people, even when we disagree with them. Let me tell you what's funny. And Bishop Graves is a Republican. So we're not a monolith, but there are certain questions that are clear. Equal protection of the law should be afforded to all people, and our safety, regardless of our orientation, should be considered at all times.
We have time for one more question?
I got excited.
Or we got a couple more. We can do it. Will, you're the hub of this conspiracy. Why don't you?
I noticed you have a brown suit on.
Yeah, it's my tan, right?
A tan suit?
Yeah.
All right, in honor of being a rebel.
Yeah.
Tim, I'm gonna ask you a really simple question, but you probably not asked this often. What's really encouraging to you about this period of time? What are the examples of things that you think, these are the things I want to see repeated?
What's encouraging is the level of energy of young people being involved around this moment. We have probably more young people engaged around the country, black, white, male, female orientation, than we've seen perhaps in history. That's encouraging. That actually is replenishing for this democracy. The goal now is, how do we ensure that they have the right set of information so they can make good decisions far beyond our years? But that is so encouraging. When I walked into this position, people say, well, what about Black Lives Matter? I mean, what you gonna do with them? I said, I'm gonna love them, I'm gonna embrace them. Because those are leaders. It's not about what vehicle young people choose to demonstrate their voice and their advocacy. It's the fact that they're choosing. And it's our job as a legacy organization to protect their right to choose, to support them when they need support, and make sure that they're defending when people are attacking them. That's our job, and that's so encouraging, and that's something that we should always continue to reinforce and support. I hope that answered your question.
He'll ask it again in the cab.
Yeah, he will.
Tim?
I'm Tim Shaw, I work here at BPC. I really appreciated the remarks you made about the bringing leadership from outside the Beltway and your local chapters and how that drives your decision-making process. And as a place and as a person who's been in DC for a long time, I feel like the longer I'm here, the less I'm connected to the folks and the places I come from. And so for us as kind of people inside the Beltway and working for places that don't have the same connections and resources on a day-to-day basis that you all have, do you have suggestions for us on how to better connect with folks who aren't quite the same, who have that outside perspective and can break through the inside the Beltway mentality that gets to us?
You know, I left DC for that reason, so I don't have a suggestion.
But we got you.
You know, I worked on the Hill for a year, and what I found myself doing was producing paper to go to meetings, to discuss the paper product, to go to meetings, to produce paper to go to meetings.
I know exactly what
And I like to touch people. I want to experience what things are. So I left. And perhaps the best decision that I could have made, because I also knew when I could get back how to catch a plane to come back and then go leave again. And one of the reasons why I have not moved to the DC area, I still live in Jackson, Mississippi, because I don't want to lose touch around what's taking place. It's more difficult for me, travel-wise. It's sometimes even more difficult when I'm home. I'm so wore out, I don't want to leave the house. But I think the DC Beltway culture can be suffocating. And so many people outside of DC are dependent on people to make policy decisions that's going to impact them when they really don't understand the impact it's going to have. And so you get to a point where your civility is so great that you're cutting deals around stuff that you don't even know what you just cut. And so it's a balance. And I don't have a clear solution, but I understand. It's a balance.
Any more thoughts or questions? Well, Derek, knowing that you took basically a day trip to Alaska a few days ago and you have probably 17 or 18 meetings, it really means a lot to us that you were willing to come spend some time. And we've had a number of good conversations about some opportunities for the BPC and NAACP to work together, and I'm really looking forward to making some of that happen. So thank you.
Thank you.